Hey there, tax fans. Welcome to State Tax Talks with me, your host, Joe Tantillo. I'm a tax attorney at the Hodgson Russ Law Firm looking to explore the nuances of state and local tax law. Here on the show, our goal is to keep tax informative, simple, and fun. So if you're ready to talk tax, turn up the volume and dive into this episode of State Tax Talks. Hey there, tax fans. Welcome back to another episode of State Tax Talks. I'm Joe Tantillo, and this is part 2 of our introduction to California tax residency rules. I'm here with Dan Kelly, partner and the SALT group at Hodgson Russ, and we're continuing our discussion on the basics of California's tax residency rules. Today, we'll be discussing the temporary or transitory purpose test, as well as the closest connections analysis. Dan, thanks again for joining me.
Hey, my pleasure, Joe. Really appreciate it.
The temporary transitory purpose test, Dan, as you well know, confuses people because it's this secondary analysis that happens regardless of the determination of domicile, because it can kind of cut both ways. It can be, and I'm going to try and state this the right way, you can be not domiciled in California, but you can be there for other than a temporary or transitory purpose and be taxed as a California resident. Or you can be domiciled in California, but you can be outside of California for other than a temporary or transitory purpose and escape California taxation.
That's exactly right. Yeah. The idea is that I think the key takeaway from this discussion and kind of thinking about California residency is that your domicile as a starting point kind of must be determined first and must be analyzed first. And if you're considered domiciled in California, you are likely taxable as a California tax resident, but not automatically. And let's start with that side of the ledger first. So as Joe mentioned, there's domicile, then there's this concept of your presence in or out of California for other than temporary or transitory purposes. So if you are domiciled in California, per the California definition of tax residency, you can still be taxable as a non-resident if during the year and period in question, you were outside of California for other than temporary or transitory purposes. So the idea is that you leave your tax domicile back in Los Angeles, right? Like, actually, let's go overseas. You're going to London for a 4-year employment assignment, right? Your stuff's back in LA, your home's back in LA, your plants are dying, but they're occasionally watered. And, so the idea is that you're still domiciled there. You still vote in LA. It's your home. However, your presence outside of California on a 4-year employment assignment with a new home in London, time in London, work in London, looks like an other than temporary presence overseas. What that allows you to basically file potentially as a California non-resident, despite the fact, your domicile remains there. So under that conception of residency, yes, you're domiciled in California. However, if you're outside the state for other than temporary or transitory purposes, you can be a California non-resident.
Does California statutorily actually give us a nice, tight definition of temporary or transitory?
It's not in the statute, but there's a regulation that has a definition. And the definition is, in my opinion, a little wishy-washy, and it's older, right? Like it's maybe goes back to older generations with respect to how you interacted with the state of California. Mm-hmm. And so the idea per the regulation of like, hey, look, what is a temporary or transitory purpose? Whether you're domiciled in California, going overseas or a different state, or you're domiciled in New York and you're going to California for whatever purpose. Because that's the other side of the ledger before we get to the actual definition is, if you're domiciled in New York, you can be a California tax resident if your presence in California is for other than temporary or transitory purposes. So flip the facts. You go from New York, you're domiciled in New York, you get a 4-year employment assignment in California. Now that looks like a non-temporary presence in California. Have a home there, 4 years of time there, connections there. Your domicile's back in New York, everyone agrees. But you can still be a California tax resident without being careful there.
Yeah, I think that's where you get into potential double tax issues too, when you don't want to be domiciled in a high tax state and also in California for other than temporary or transitory purposes, because you're going to end up paying tax twice on a lot of your income, and maybe you get a credit, but maybe you don't, depending on the type of income, depending on the state. We always like to highlight double tax risks on this show.
Yeah, and I think part of the reason, like I said, why kind of the intersection of California and New York in particular, it's because if you wind up as a dual resident or without the ability to take a resident credit in one place or the other, it's a big, huge number, right? It's potentially over 25% kind of combined basis.
Yeah, plus your crazy 30% or whatever at the federal levels. Basically, you just paid all your income back to the government in taxes.
Right, and maybe plus interest, maybe plus penalties in one state or the other, right? So it's really, really important to kind of nail this stuff. And so when you're thinking about it, it's like, okay, domicile is the most important, but domicile is also a gateway to figuring out what temporary or transitory tests we apply. If you're domiciled in California, it's were you someplace else for other than temp or trans purposes.
Yes.
If you're domiciled in New York, it's were you in California for other than temp or trans purposes, right? So that test, the definition in the regulation, it's kind of a mouthful. It's like a couple of paragraphs. And what it talks about is these are examples of situations that are temporary, like going to California to recover quickly from a medical procedure, a couple months, no problem, temporary. Going to California briefly to complete an employment contract, no problem, temporary. Example situations that are not temporary. I kind of transitioned to California for a longer term period of recuperation. I have an illness that the climate in California is better for me. I have an employment contract of a couple of years. Maybe that starts to get closer to non-temporary or is in fact non-temporary. So the definitional aspects are often not spot on to a client's facts, right? Like they're narrow in the sense that not everybody can say, oh yeah, I'm that person who came to California for 3 months to recover from a back injury.
Yeah.
Right.
And the vague nature of it certainly leans into exactly what California legislators would want, which is to be able to look at everything on a case-by-case basis and determine it based on the facts of that specific taxpayer.
And that's kind of what happens next. So the way that I think about it is analyze domicile, get through that. Check out your presumptions and your safe harbors, see if those apply. You can never kind of check out of a California analysis for residency without looking at temporary or transitory purpose. It's in the statute, so you got to take a peek at it. And if the regulation or if the facts are clear of your purpose being temporary or not, case ends right there, right? Like it's either temporary or it's not, it's transitory or it's not, we can maybe stop there. If it's too close to call, if it's not dispositive, the regulation, now we switch into this closest connections analysis, which is probably where most of the published cases seem to go, where all of a sudden the California Franchise Tax Board, taxpayers, the California Office of Tax Appeals, prior tax tribunals are looking at really kind of a very extensive factor list, a lot like the domicile analysis, by the way. Maybe not exactly, but a very extensive factor list to determine where, in fact, were that taxpayer's connections closer in the year or period in question. And the answer to that question is where the taxpayer's California tax residency was or was not, right? So if the question is between New York and California, where are my connections closest? If it's New York, you're a California non-resident essentially for that tax year. If you've gotten to this part of the analysis and they determine that, they can use that determination to infer that you were not in California for other than temporary or transitory purposes. It's a little complicated, but the idea is that, if in fact you are in this soup of looking at your closest connections, really substantial number of factors, kind of varies as different as the seasons from taxpayer to taxpayer. But some courts have started to standardize that in terms of the types of factors, the categories of factors that you would look at.
Yeah, I think Bragg was the first, probably not the first, but Bragg's one of the more recent cases that really starts to get into the specifics of the categories for each factor. There's kind of 3 tranches of categories, and then within each of those, there's like individual things that they're looking at. Is that right?
That's exactly right. And I have here in front of me the reg addressing temporary and transitory purpose. I'm just going to read the first sentence because I think it kind of sets this up. It says, whether or not the purpose for which an individual is in this state, i.e. California, will be considered temporary or transitory in character will depend to a large extent upon the facts and circumstances of each particular case. So it goes on to give kind of a couple quick, kind of examples. But the idea is you got to look at everything. You got to look at kind of every single, aspect of their life that's relevant. And so just thinking about the Bragg factors. So basically what the court basically decided was that it was aggregating numerous cases prior to its own decision several years ago. But the idea is that you break the factors and you break the review of these closer connections factors into a few different buckets. And you prioritize, kind of no specific factor. You look at all these things kind of comprehensively. There's kind of, I think, recurring factors, Joe, that we see, popping up in audits, we see popping up in cases that taxpayers would be really wise to kind of keep an eye on.
Yeah. And so what are some of those factors, Dan?
Great question. And that's really, I think, what detailed California residency reviews need to look at, kind of from the perspective of what might the Franchise Tax Board be interested in? How might a taxpayer really understand whether or not they're triggering California tax residency? First, there's a series of kind of, call it administrative or clerical type of factors. And it's not that these factors get less weight. They're still very important. But, they're easy to do. So when something is easy to do, it necessarily maybe gets put to the bottom of the list in terms of bearing on your actual residency. So getting a license, registering a vehicle, registering to vote, contacting your vendors and changing your mailing address, joining a library, joining a gym, things like that you can kind of do quickly to enhance your residency.
Yeah, in New York, we tend to call them formalities or other factors, and they definitely get less weight there. I think they get a little more weight in California than they do in New York.
Well, certainly they're not carved out like they are in New York, where it's like set aside. Like you don't even look at the formalities in New York until you analyze the 5 primary factors.
Right.
In California, for this temp and transitory purpose test, it's part of the analysis. It's right there. It's right as kind of one of the main brag categories is looking at all these different connections.
Yeah. How about category 2? We've got administrative and clerical as category. We'll call it category A. What's B?
Yeah, I think of B as, kind of, and again, this varies from case to case and, kind of merges. I think of B as kind of your property connections. So think about it from the perspective of where's your primary residence? Where is any investment real property you own or control? Do you invest in California businesses? Where's your personal property? Was there a moving truck involved in your move or your change of residency? Where are the items that are still important to you? And what about your family? Where do they keep their stuff? What about kind of important connections to you from a, kind of investment portfolio or assets? I think of kind of the second factor. Again, this is the factors kind of overlap and merge with each other. But as, where's your property? Where are your ownership of assets? And does that lean towards California or not? And then the third bucket comprises, I think, a couple really critical elements, which is where's your family, right? Like, did you bring your kids with you? Did your spouse come with you? If the answer to those questions are no, I don't know. I mean, maybe you're not in California for other than temporary purposes. If you're going back every weekend to see your wife and your kids, right? Like, that can be very, very interesting and important to a residency case. Same with time, right? Number of days, the quantity of days, the quality of days, the type of days. California cases, I think, are instructive with respect to how time is analyzed in California residency audits.
They split days down way further than New York will. New York might look at a half a day here and there, but I've seen some California analysis of days where they're like, you spent 17.8 days in California and 21.3 in Nevada.
Yeah, and so the import of that was, in that specific case, I think that's a matter of Bracamonte, which is a fairly recent residency decision, where the judge kind of looks at the average length of stay during the period of time. And that's an interesting way to chop up the time analysis. Didn't look at like how much necessarily. I think that was how much of time was still relevant in the overall analysis. But the judge actually found important the length of stays.
Yeah.
So the California stays were longer than the Nevada stays, even though there were more Nevada days, right? And so, the idea there was maybe it's consistent with someone's home to spend longer chunks of time there. That's kind of a cheap one. I'm not really sure there's much import to that. People live their lives in different ways. And, maybe for whatever reason, they were kind of commuting from Nevada to someplace else or, just kind of broke that year differently than it would in different years. But time is super important with respect to not only domicile, but also the temporary and transitory purpose analysis.
Time, property, family, for sure. In business connections too.
And business kind of might permeate all those, because you might contact your employer about your withholding. That's like an admin connection. The location of your job and how you earn property and income is maybe a property connection. But also, kind of, are you starting new businesses? Are you getting on boards? Are you kind of engaging your new community in a way that's consistent with making your home there, your kind of primary residence there, and your either, kind of temporary or transitory connections there? If you plop a 1-year employment contract on the table, that looks temporary, right? A year, in my opinion, is pretty temporary. Not always, but very often. If it's 3 or 4 years, it's kind of the opposite, right?
Yep.
It looks non-temporary. And then kind of in between is just kind of too close to call. There's cases that go in both directions. So, looking at the factors, maybe someday we do one of these and we just go literally factor by factor down the brag list.
I think that's a great idea.
And give like an example of something that's popped up in a case of each of them.
Stay tuned for that episode, fans.
Because the idea there is the brag factors are technically a temporary and transitory purpose analysis. Looking at the location of the brag's domicile was the first part of that case. And it was between, I believe, Arizona and California. And once you got past that, it was, all right, now we have to look at these factors. And so we're kind of talking about 2 distinct residency concepts, domicile and your presence on a temporary or transitory basis. But the reality is there's a lot of overlap in these kind of factors and connections we're talking about. And if your domicile is in one location, it may very well follow that you were in that location on an other than temporary basis, right? So not in every case. There are examples in, kind of situation that doesn't happen. But certainly, I think from a California perspective, you're thinking about 2 things, domicile and then presence for other than temporary or transitory purposes. Just like in New York, you would think about domicile and statutory residency.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah, you have to keep both in mind.
Yeah, both balls are in the air at all times, and you really kind of cannot complete a residency audit or case without looking at each of those connections.
Yeah. Well, Dan, thank you very much for joining the panel today. Certainly, we will be talking much more about California residency, as well as a whole mess of other California state tax specific rules going forward. But unfortunately, our time for today has come to a close. And there's a lot more to discuss, even on the concept of domicile, of temporary transitory purpose, of closest connections test. But like I said, we'll be talking about that much more in the future. I think this was a good initial kind of intro 101 discussion for our listeners out there to just give them, a small taste of what they need to be thinking about in the context of California residency planning. Any parting thoughts for our listeners, Dan?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Like maybe you now have enough to be dangerous, or these are just kind of reinforcing concepts that you thought before. I think that if you take anything from this, it's that, kind of changing residency requires real change. Mm-hmm. It requires being diligent. It requires being thoughtful and showing your intent and keeping proof. And so, kind of, especially from California with the highest single tax jurisdiction in the United States and any kind of local jurisdiction with the kind of surcharges, above 13%, it is really pays to be thoughtful about it and to be ready for an audit, ready for, kind of what comes next, and to make sure that you're kind of understanding these rules and how they affect.
Absolutely. Dan, thank you again for joining us. For all of you listeners out there, thank you for listening. Please give us a 5-star review, subscribe, share with your friends, share with your colleagues, and share with people who are leaving California, New York, or any other high-tax state out there. For State Tax Talks, I'm Joe Tantillo, and we'll see you next time. Thanks for joining us for another episode of State Tax Talks. If you're interested in listening to more episodes, we're available on all platforms where podcasts can be found, including YouTube. If you enjoyed this episode of State Tax Talks with Joe Tantillo, please give us a 5-star review on your favorite podcast platform. And if you're in need of a tax professional, you can contact the tax attorneys at Hodgson Russ. Go to www.hodgsonruss.com for more information. And until next time, I'm Joe Tantillo, and this is State Tax Talks. Catch you later, tax fans. The comments contained in this podcast do not constitute legal advice. The opinions herein are the opinions of the speakers and not the official opinion of the Hodgson Russ Law Firm.